What drives a man to kill without remorse? What lurks inside the mind of a murderer who seems to kill just for the thrill of it? Welcome to the Murder Maze, where we dive into the darkest corners of a human psyche. Today, we explore the chilling story of Patrick Mackay, one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, a man who called himself the Devil's Disciple. Patrick David Mackay was born on September 25, 1952, in Dartford, Kent, England. His early years were marked by instability, abuse, and a growing sense of detachment from reality. His father, Harold Mackay, was a heavy-drinking, violent man who ruled the household with an iron fist. The young Patrick often bore the brunt of his father's drunken rages, suffering physical and emotional abuse that would shape his troubled psyche. His mother, Marion Mackay, was a timid woman, constantly walking on eggshells around her husband. She tried to protect Patrick and his siblings from Harold's outbursts, but the home was filled with fear and dysfunction. The abuse was relentless, and Patrick internalized this violence, becoming increasingly withdrawn and resentful. As a child, Patrick showed early signs of psychological disturbances. He was prone to temper tantrums that were far beyond normal childhood behavior. His fits of rage would come suddenly and violently, often resulting in damage to objects around the house or harm to animals. These were warning signs, signals that something dark was festering inside him. By the time he was 5 years old, Patrick had begun to develop a cruel streak. Neighbors and relatives noticed his disturbing behavior. He would torture small animals, an early hallmark of psychopathy. He seemed to derive pleasure from watching creatures suffer, often strangling birds, mutilating cats, and setting fire to insects. His fascination with death and suffering was evident even before he reached primary school. Patrick's school life was just as troubled. Teachers described him as an aggressive and unpredictable child, quick to anger and difficult to control. He had no interest in academics and struggled to form friendships. Other children found him strange and intimidating. His outbursts of violence made him a feared figure in the classroom. One particular incident stood out. At the age of 10, Patrick attempted to strangle another student with a belt during a playground fight. This shocking act led to his first encounter with child psychologists, who noted his lack of empathy and inability to control his impulses. Even at such a young age, he displayed characteristics commonly found in dangerous offenders: lack of remorse, a fixation on violence, and a growing disdain for authority. As he entered his teenage years, Patrick's violent tendencies escalated. His father's death in 1962, when Patrick was just 10 years old, served as a major turning point in his life. While some boys would have mourned the loss of their father, Patrick reacted with cold indifference. If anything, his behavior became even more unhinged. Without his father's presence, Patrick became uncontrollable. He started engaging in petty crime, breaking into homes, stealing valuables, and setting fires. His mother, unable to cope with his worsening behavior, sent him to various juvenile institutions, hoping professionals could help reform him. But psychiatric evaluations only confirmed the worst fears. Patrick was developing into a highly disturbed young man. During his time in reform schools and psychiatric hospitals, he was diagnosed with various personality disorders, including psychopathy and schizophrenia. Doctors noted his fascination with Hitler and the Nazis, his growing obsession with violence, and his complete lack of empathy for others. He would often speak about death and killing with an eerie detachment, as though discussing an ordinary hobby. By the time Patrick Mackay reached his late teens, he was fully immersed in a world of darkness. He had already started experimenting with more extreme acts of violence, attacking strangers, and showing no remorse for his actions. He idolized notorious murderers and spoke openly about his fantasies of killing. Authorities had ample warnings that Mackay was a danger to society, but little was done to stop him before he turned his fantasies into reality. As Patrick Mackay entered adulthood, his violent tendencies only grew stronger. By the early 1970s, he had fully embraced a lifestyle of crime and brutality. His obsession with Nazism deepened, and he openly referred to himself as Franklin Bolvolt I, an alter ego he created to separate himself from reality. He spent much of his time wandering the streets of London, engaging in robberies and assaults, often targeting vulnerable people. Mackay moved frequently, sometimes living in cheap flats and other times on the streets. He relied on theft to sustain himself, breaking into homes and stealing valuables. But more concerning was his increasing need to physically harm those he encountered. His psychiatric issues, including his diagnosed schizophrenia and severe personality disorder, made him a ticking time bomb. One of the earliest indicators of his homicidal intent was his unprovoked attacks on strangers. He would randomly assault people, often elderly individuals who had no way of defending themselves. He had no clear motive, only an urge to exert power and inflict pain. The thrill of violence became an addiction for him. His relationship with his mother, Marion, also deteriorated. She had tried to support him despite his unstable behavior, but Mackay grew more resentful of her. At one point, he reportedly set fire to their home, an act that some believe was an attempt to kill her. Though she survived, their relationship was forever fractured, and he became even more isolated. In 1973, Mackay's fantasies of murder turned into reality. His first known victim was 87-year-old Isabella Griffiths, whom he strangled to death in her home. Unlike most killers who might try to conceal their crimes, Mackay seemed indifferent. He calmly left the crime scene without taking precautions, showing a disturbing lack of fear or guilt. Over the next 2 years, he would go on to kill multiple people, mainly elderly individuals who were unable to fight back. He used a variety of methods: stabbings, strangulation, and bludgeoning, all while continuing his burglaries and violent attacks on strangers. Some reports suggest he may have killed up to 11 people, though only 3 murders were officially confirmed. Despite his increasing violence, Mackay remained a ghost to law enforcement for a while. It wasn't until he casually bragged about his crimes to an acquaintance that police finally caught up with him. In 1975, he was arrested and interrogated. When confronted with evidence, he confessed to 3 murders but hinted at many more. His cold and detached demeanor during his confession left investigators disturbed. He spoke about killing as if it were an everyday activity, showing no signs of remorse. His willingness to discuss his crimes so openly raised the question, just how many victims had there really been? Patrick Mackay's murderous spree took place between 1974 and 1975, though authorities believe he may have killed up to 11 people. His victims were mostly elderly and vulnerable individuals whom he attacked in their homes. Mackay's first known victim was 87-year-old Isabella Griffiths. She was a quiet and reserved woman who lived alone in London. Mackay, who had developed a habit of befriending the elderly to gain access to their homes, visited her under false pretenses. Once inside, he strangled her to death and left without taking any valuables. The crime went unsolved at the time, as there was no immediate suspect. Adele Price, 1975. Adele Price, another elderly woman, fell victim to Mackay's violence in early 1975. He gained access to her home in Chelsea, London, likely using the same deceptive tactics he had used before. He stabbed her multiple times in a brutal and frenzied attack. Her home was ransacked, and her body was left in a gruesome state. Again, Mackay did not seem motivated by robbery. His primary drive was the act of killing itself. Father Anthony Crean, 1975. Perhaps Mackay's most infamous murder was that of Father Anthony Crean, a Catholic priest in the village of Shorne, Kent. The two had a prior encounter when Mackay had stolen money from the priest. Father Crean, being a forgiving man, did not press charges but distanced himself from Mackay. However, Mackay harbored resentment. On March 21st, 1975, he returned to Father Crean's home with violent intent. He forced his way in and launched a savage attack, first beating the elderly priest and then submerging him in a bath filled with water. Mackay then used an axe to bludgeon him to death, striking him multiple times. The crime scene was horrific, with blood splattered across the walls. This brutal killing became a key piece of evidence in securing Mackay's conviction. He later admitted to killing up to 11 people, though he frequently changed his statements. Some of his suspected victims include a homeless man found beaten to death in London. Mackay had once bragged about attacking a vagrant, though he later retracted his confession. An elderly woman who survived his attack. One woman was able to escape after Mackay attempted to strangle her. She later identified him to police. Various missing persons cases from the early 1970s. Authorities have linked Mackay to several unsolved murders of elderly people, but no concrete evidence has surfaced. Murder methods and psychology. Mackay's murders followed a disturbing pattern. He targeted elderly individuals, often gaining access through deception. His killings were exceptionally violent, often involving strangulation, blunt force trauma, or stabbing. He showed no remorse, frequently boasting about his crimes. He lacked a clear motive beyond a desire for control and violence. Patrick Mackay's reign of terror came to an end in March 1975, shortly after the murder of Father Anthony Crean. Investigators had been monitoring Mackay due to his history of violence and psychiatric issues, and when reports emerged of an unusual visitor to Father Crean's home shortly before his murder, authorities quickly turned their attention to Mackay. Patrick Mackay's arrest came as a result of a combination of investigative work and his own careless boasting. Following the brutal slaying of Father Crean, Mackay made the mistake of talking openly about his crimes to acquaintances. These individuals, alarmed by his chilling confessions, informed the police. Authorities apprehended Mackay at his home in London, where he was living in a chaotic state. When officers arrived, they found a deeply disturbed man who did not resist arrest. He appeared calm, even indifferent to the fact that he was being taken into custody. Interrogation and initial confessions. During questioning, Mackay initially displayed a cold, detached demeanor. When pressed about the murder of Father Crean, he admitted to the crime with disturbing nonchalance. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a highly dangerous individual, one who took pleasure in recounting the details of his killings. After admitting to the priest's murder, Mackay shocked detectives by casually mentioning other killings. He initially claimed responsibility for up to 11 murders, describing in detail how he had selected, stalked, and killed his victims. He spoke of strangling Isabella Griffiths, stabbing Adele Price, and attacking others whose cases remained unsolved. However, Mackay's confessions soon became erratic. At times, he seemed to revel in the attention, exaggerating his crimes or withdrawing statements altogether. This pattern made it difficult for investigators to determine the true extent of his killing spree. Some murders he described fit known unsolved cases, while others appeared to be fabrications. Trial and conviction. Despite Mackay's shifting statements, prosecutors had enough evidence to charge him with multiple murders. His trial was held in November 1975, where the court heard chilling details of his brutality. Forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Mackay's own confessions secured his conviction. Mackay was ultimately found guilty of 3 murders, those of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he never be released. Unanswered questions. Although Mackay is serving a life sentence, doubts remain about the true number of his victims. Authorities believe he may be responsible for more killings, but without concrete evidence, those cases remain officially unsolved. Even decades later, Patrick Mackay remains one of Britain's most chilling serial killers, a man whose capacity for violence seemed limitless and whose confessions left behind more questions than answers.